Hey everyone, Sparks back with another Goddess Victory Nikke video. We have a couple more days with Mari before her banner disappears, and after using her for a full week, this is the final word on if she was worth building or if you should still pull for her if you haven't already. I'll tell you the ugly truth about Mari for most players with some hard numbers and my own experience. I also did a full review for Asuka and Rei, so check that out in the link below if you haven't already seen that. Alright, so let's take a quick look at the text of her skills first. Skill 1 activates when landing an attack with full charge and gives allies a buff that increases damage to shields by 100% for 3 seconds. So as long as you're not quick scoping, this has basically 100% uptime for the whole team. This was extremely valuable for the Angel raid and was actually a way better buff than the similar buffs that Asuka and Rei give only themselves. It allowed whatever completely busted DPS unit you were using like Red Hood to deal literal double damage. Getting through that shield ASAP was key to a high score, and Mari did it better than anyone. But how valuable is this buff now that the solo raid is over? Maybe not that valuable. That said, I'm sure it will not be useless. There will be more enemies with shields to deal with. Skill 1 also buffs allies' pierce damage by 40% when hitting cores. This is a very team-specific buff, but is a very strong buff when dealing multiple hits per core with pierce hits. Skill 2 is an active buff that goes off every 10 seconds and gives herself pierce for 5 seconds. Obviously, this synergizes with Skill 1, plus it buffs all allies' attack for 5 seconds by 30% of her attack. This skill is a nice buff, but is probably the lowest priority on the list for leveling up. My initial testing also showed that despite the buff being based on her attack, not final attack, getting multiple copies of her makes very little difference as far as your overall damage goes. Her burst is a 20-second cooldown, which gives all allies attack damage up 40% for 10 seconds. This is a crazy strong buff that when paired with units like Red Hood, Alice, or Asuka, makes their damage dummy high during full burst. She also nukes the whole team, or the whole field rather, herself for 640% of her final attack as damage. This is what makes her truly great against both bosses and mobs of enemies. Believe it or not, this skill is even good in Arena. Her overload lines don't make too much difference. She's a low priority, honestly, for equipment resources, but if you do level up her gear, I would hope for charge speed above everything else. Second priority would be attack, and third, probably max ammo. Elemental damage actually isn't too great because if you are focusing on elemental damage in a fight, you will want the advantage with your main DPS. Probably not really worried about Mari herself, and currently we don't have a strong electric pierce unit to use with Mari, so the elemental damage will oftentimes just be completely wasted. I would recommend using the charge speed cube with her. Technically the resilience cube is probably better, but unless you are changing your cubes every time, you're better off keeping that on other units. If you're finding the video interesting or useful, please give it a like and consider subscribing to help the channel grow. I'll also be opening a pilgrim mold at the end of the video. Pray for me. Anyway, here are the numbers in the shooting range. I ran loads of these tests, but here's the TLDR. Using a standardized Pierce team with Leader, Mari, Alice, Red Hood, and Maxwell, I put up an average score of 858 million damage. And here's an example of individual damage numbers. Alice scored 265 million, Red Hood 366 million, Maxwell 80 million, of course she was off burst, and Mari herself did 122 million. Now I did a similar comparison test for my initial impressions video when she first came out, but this was much more iterative and I tried several different teams, but this team was the most relevant to the test and kind of testing the most DPS units that I felt were the most relevant. So next I did the same squad but used Crown instead of Mari. They scored an average of about 115 million damage less. That's a difference of 13%. This number will skew closer to 10% against a single target boss. Now individual damage for Alice is 226 million, that's a decrease of 39 million. Red Hood did 308 million, that's a decrease of 58 million. Maxwell did 89 million. That's actually an increase of 9 million damage. And Crown actually did almost the exact same as Maxwell at 89 million compared to Mari in the previous squad who did 122 million. So big advantage to the Mari squad by almost every metric as far as all-out damage goes, whether it's overall or individual units doing damage. Now, let's talk about a few different squads you would realistically want to make with Mari. And by the way, you know, Crown is still an amazing unit, and overall is probably going to be better, but just think about the fact that you can make squads that do out-damage Crown with Mari. Okay, so when making a squad, Mari's Pierce damage buff will be less impactful if your DPS already has buffs like Pierce damage, True damage, etc. Basically any damage word buff, because they will be additive. If it's an attack buff, you'll be fine. Great squad mates include Dorothy, Leader, Volume for your Burst 1s, Red Hood, Maxwell, Alice, Snow White, Helm, and Asuka for the Burst 3s. And even Rapunzel. We'll get back to that a little bit later. Mari teams often end up being a bit fragile because typical healers are also Burst 2, and Mari's a Burst 2, so you kind of see the issue there. So consider Helm or Rapunzel as needed. By far the best DPS for her to support is Red Hood, so a great team for raids will be Volume, Mari, Red Hood, Maxwell, and Winter Ludmilla. Or Rapunzel if you're struggling to stay alive. In theory, Double D would be good with them, but I found, at least in the last raid, she was more useful on a different team. Of course, we were worried about, like splitting up our fire damage as well, so that was a consideration. Same goes for Dorothy and Leader. They could also be used. This team can also be very effective against Anomaly Interception Ultra Boss. Crown makes the fight a bit easier because her shield allows you to just ignore a lot of Ultra's mechanics, but if you don't have her or you want to maul out for a all-out DPS, this Mori team can do well. Another strong team that leans into the fire element more, or the fire element advantage, you can use Mari with Asuka, even though they do have the overlapping buff with Pierce damage. Also using Alice, Leader, or Double D, and then any flex unit. I also just did hard Chapter 22, Nihilister, the second time you fight her, with a power deficit using Dorothy, Asuka, Mari, Alice, and Rapunzel. To be honest, I was surprised how well this worked. When I used this squad, I just cleared it on my first try. Mari is also a sleeper Snow White supporter. If you're fighting a boss with multiple parts to shoot through or a respawning core, Snow White will really benefit from Mari. You can also do a full Snow White team with Mari or with Mari and either Volume or Miranda, Snow White, Maxwell, and then either Helm or Yulha if you really are going like all-out damage. But I generally prefer to just include her in a more generalized squad. Initially, I would have never thought Mari would be good in Arena, since a lot of her kit is based off of Pierce damage, which is pretty much meaningless in PvP, but in the right squad, she can actually be very effective. Her usefulness comes from her burst, which isn't generally strong enough to actually wipe the enemy team, but when buffed with someone like Red Hood in slot 1 or combined with another AoE burst, you can get good results. Snipers also have inherent advantages with decent burst generation and low numbers on, low hit counts on attack, I should say. She's not actually the new meta, of course, but she could make some people's teams. As I've said before, Mari low-key might be the most valuable of all the Eva collab units, and have the longest life going forward. She's surprisingly strong generalist that isn't focused on one thing, but is also top tier in specific things. So she is a strong unit that is surprisingly useful in multiple modes and squads, and can get top tier damage when molding for raids. She's also effective without needing extra copies. This is a free player dream, right? Or is it? She's a limited unit, so realistically, the reality is that a lot of people will just miss her. If you started the game next week, you're out of luck. And she's a really good unit. Plus, she was the third of a limited collab units, which we've never even had 3 limited collab units before. So even if you are playing right now, you might not have had the resources to get her. I'm pretty sure most people pulled for Asuka and maybe Rey before Mari was even released. On the other hand, if you already did get her and you dumped a lot of resources into getting copies or leveling up her gear, it could be considered a waste because she performs pretty well, just, you know, like at a base level. People are going for the pinnacle of leaderboards, or just a giant Eva fan will want to drip her out, but otherwise you're good with 1 copy and just leveling her skills to 4 and her burst to 7. Don't worry too much about her gear either. If you don't have her at all, I feel bad for you. Okay, so let's get back into the client and do this pilgrim mold. Generally, I have really good luck with this. I think I've only missed 1, maybe 2, and I'm a day 1 player, but it's still scary. It's connecting. Oh my god, way to slow roll me. And it's Black Shadow. That is definitely a W. I will take it. Molds never fail for me. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions about Mari and, you know, what your thoughts are on her. I'm always interested in your feedback. Don't forget to give the video a like. Consider giving me a sub if you found this useful, and I'll catch you guys in the next video or stream.